I mentioned in an earlier class that there are several kinds of blessings. There are blessings that we recite to extol God's wonders. When you hear thunder and see lightning, there's a blessing for that. There are blessings that we say in the morning when we wake up, thanking God for the ability to function, walking, seeing, and other bodily functions. Whenever we use the washroom and we take care of our bodily needs, we thank God for that the plumbing works. Imagine how bad it would be if it wouldn't work. That's one category, thanking God for different physical phenomena. Then there is a category of blessings that we say before doing a mitzvah. Before we put on tefillin, there's a blessing. We thank God for giving us the commandment to put on tefillin. Before we light Shabbat candles, we thank God for giving us that opportunity to light the Shabbat candles. Before any, I shouldn't say any mitzvah, there are many mitzvahs that don't have a blessing, which is a subject of discussion. I have a book of 500 pages discussing all the mitzvahs that have no blessing, why they have no blessing. But most of the commandments that we do, we say a blessing beforehand. What I want to talk about today is the third category, called Birchot HaNehanin, blessings of pleasure. Before we eat anything, we're supposed to thank God with a blessing. And there is a special fixed formula for each and every category of food. And I'll go through the different categories, and then we're going to focus today mostly on the blessing of Hamotzi. But first, where do these blessings come around? I assume that people always, in the Jewish community, always said blessings before they ate, because it's so fundamental to Judaism to express gratitude to God. And food is what keeps us alive. How could you not express gratitude and not take it for granted that the food is going to be there automatically? So I assume that they always had blessings, but when were the actual texts of the blessings instituted? They were instituted at the time of the Second Temple, the beginning of the Second Temple era. We're talking about 300-400 years before the Common Era. And the people who instituted were called the Men of the Great Assembly. The Men of the Great Assembly. The Men of the Great Assembly were a collection of prophets like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. These are biblical prophets, the last prophets of the prophetic era. Among them was Mordechai, the hero of Purim. You had a whole bunch of others. Ezra, who was the leader of the Jewish people at the time of the Second Temple era. They composed most of our daily prayers, and they also composed the blessings that we say before eating. And the question that could be asked, why weren't blessings instituted earlier? I didn't see any real discussion about this, so I'm going to try to find some explanation. Why weren't the blessings instituted earlier? If people said blessings, that may be true, but it was never institutionalized until the beginning of the Second Temple era. So let's see what the Talmud says about the importance of saying a blessing before we eat. And the categories are, number one, bread. Before eating bread, there's a special blessing, which we're going to be discussing soon. Hamotzi is the short title of it. Before drinking wine, wine is a very unique beverage, and therefore requires a separate blessing other than any other drink. Fruit has its own blessing, all fruits, and all vegetables have their own blessing. And then there's miscellaneous, which means everything else that wasn't included, including meat, eggs, any type of beverage, fish, they're all given a miscellaneous blessing. Okay, so the reason why we have blessings comes from the Talmud, and it says as follows: it is forbidden to benefit from this world without a blessing. If someone did benefit, it is a violation of the law of benefiting from something holy because it was consecrated for the use in the holy temple. What that means is that if I, in the days of the temple, if someone said, I am donating some food to the temple or any other object, I'm donating a cow, a horse, a house, a table, whatever it is, that property is now off limits to everyone else. It can only be used for the temple purposes. It can be sold and the money is used for temple expenses, but it can't be used for anything else. And if someone does take advantage and benefits from it, it's not just called theft, it has its own title. It's called mi'ila, not to be confused with mila, which is circumcision. Mi'ila means it's a blasphemous form of theft where you're stealing from God's own property. That is a more serious, and if a person did it, if they have to atone for it by paying for it, by bringing a sacrifice, and so on. Yes?
Is all food holy?
No. We're talking about if you don't say a blessing, it's as if you benefited from the temple. So it's as if it was holy. But it's the same crime. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, whoever derives pleasure from this world without reciting a blessing, he says the same thing essentially. It is as if he derived benefit from sacred articles designated for heaven. As it says, the earth and its environs are God's. There's a biblical verse that says everything belongs to God. So everything is, as you just suggested, is holy. Everything is property of God. How do we have a right to take God's property? And therefore, it's as if you have violated the law of taking something that is property of the holy temple. So what does this mean on a simple level? When we say a blessing, what are we doing? We are acknowledging that God is the one who gave us the food. If you ask a little child, where does food come from? He says, the refrigerator. If he's a little older, he says, the supermarket. If he's a little older, he says, from the farm. But if you're a little bit more sophisticated, you say it comes from God. Yes, it went through the farming process, it got stored, it got transported to the supermarket, and it ends up in the refrigerator or on your table. But really, where it comes from is from God. How do we acknowledge that? Because it would be very insulting if let's say someone is really in need of some food, and I get them the food that was very scarce, and I give it to someone who gives it to the person who's hungry, and they thank the person who gave it to them, who did nothing, just handed it to them, but the one who really got the food is not even acknowledged. That's a problem. That's a moral problem. So when we eat food, we have to acknowledge, otherwise God considers it as if we had stolen from him, if we don't acknowledge that it is God who brings us the food. They tell the story of Reb Zusha. Reb Zusha was one of the great Hasidic masters, and he was very poor, and someone would bring him food and put it down in front of him. But nevertheless, he would always say, God, could you please provide me with food? And then the waiter would bring him his food. And the waiter got a little upset with the rabbi after a while. He says, why is he thanking God, thinking that God brought him the food? I bring him the food. So one day he says, I'm going to teach him a lesson. I'm not going to provide any food for him. That day, Reb Zusha was walking, and he was very poor, so he was dressed in rags, and a rich man who didn't know who that was thought he's going to poke some fun. And there was like a little stream, and there was a log over the stream to cross it, and Reb Zusha was on the log, and this rich man comes and pushes him into the stream and gets him all wet and dirty, and starts laughing that he poked fun at this beggar. someone happened to be witnessing this who knew who Reb Zusha was. He says to this rich man, "You're in big trouble now. This is one of the holiest people around. And look what you did to him. You pushed him into the water, into the mud." So the man says, "What should I do?" He says, "You better appease him." So this man got a whole shipment of food. And as Reb Zusha comes to eat his breakfast, there's nothing on the table. And the waiter is like looking to see what Reb Zusha is going to do. And Zusha says, "God, please provide me with food." And then a package gets thrown into the room and lands on his table in front of him. So you think the food came from the refrigerator, from the oven. No, it came from God. That food is only there by grace of God. That's essentially what the bracha is supposed to get us to realize. And every time we say it, we're supposed to think that this is where the food really comes. Of course, if the waiter serves you the food, you thank the waiter. The Talmud says that the wine belongs to one person, but you still thank the waiter for delivering it. So you have to show appreciation to people who facilitate getting you the food, but you have to realize they're the waiters. God is the real one who's giving you the food. And maybe that's the reason why in the first temple era, there was no need for that. Because the first temple era was very different from the second temple era. In the first temple, God's presence was much more clearly felt. It was a much more dynamic and powerful expression that didn't exist in the second temple. The second temple, the Talmud says, was lacking a lot of different things. Spirituality was not the same. I'm not saying it didn't exist, but it was on a much lower level. So in the first temple era, they didn't need the formal blessing. Maybe they said it, maybe they didn't, but they didn't need it because they were aware of it without the blessing. Yes?
I'm not sure, this may sound like a little technicality, but I don't think it is. I'm not sure, when you say God gave us the food, God created the food, but the way He gave it to us. I'm not sure when you say God created it. He didn't give it to us. He created it.
And He provided us with a waiter. The waiter is physically...
Right, but that's another thing.
Yeah.
But He didn't give it to us. That's.
Well, it got to us, and everything,
Right.
Nothing exists outside of God, so He must have given it to us. That's exactly the point, that we have to psych ourselves into realizing that everything that happens to us is through God's power. And yes, we do give credit to the people who make the right choices to use God's power the right way. That's why when someone is nice to you, even though it's God's power, it's God's everything, but He had choice not to be nice. Human beings have free choice. If a animal does something nice for you, you could argue that you can't thank the animal. The animal did what was instinctive. It was God doing it, and the animal was the instrument, but the animal didn't have choice. Certainly if it was not even an animal, if it was just a physical phenomenon, that a wind blew and all of a sudden some food ended up on your table. You're not going to thank the wind. That was what the early idolaters did. They thanked the sun. They worshiped the sun. Why? They said the sun is giving us everything that we get from the sun. No, the sun is an instrument. You don't thank the hammer. You don't praise the hammer for building a house. You thank the builder, the carpenter. So that seems to be the focus of the saying of the blessings. But here a question has been asked. The Rebbe asked this question. The food is God's, so it's holy. Now that we say the blessing, the food is no longer holy. It sounds a little strange that the blessing de-sanctifies the food. Food inherently is divine. That's what it says. God owns everything. It's all His. So that means it's holy. And then all of a sudden, when we say the blessing, the food is no longer holy. We can even consume it. That doesn't sound, that's counterintuitive. That doesn't sound right. So the Rebbe explained, the food remains holy. But God invites us to eat at His table. You are now allowed to participate in eating holy food. because you have now been invited by God by virtue of you saying the blessing unto his table. It's like the president invites you for lunch. Make sure to order a kosher meal if he does. There's a kosher kitchen in the White House. At least they used to have it kosher, but they make kosher meals in the White House when the Jewish groups come there. So the president invites you to the White House, and he's serving you good kosher food. You are eating someone else's, the president's food, but no, you have now been elevated to be at the table of the president. And that's what happens when you make a bracha. You're no longer an outsider to God, you're an insider. There's an interesting law. I mentioned the truma, the tithing. When in Israel, you're supposed to take 2% of your produce and give it to the Kohen. The law still applies today, except you can't give it to the Kohen because the Kohen is not ritually pure, so it's burnt. But you're supposed to take 2% of your produce, called truma. Truma means a tithe, a separation. And the Kohen is the only one allowed to eat it. If a non-Kohen eats truma, that is a crime. It's not permitted. But what happens if the Kohen is married to a non-Kohen woman, a woman whose father was not a Kohen? She's a regular Jew, like most of us are. And we're not allowed to eat truma, but she could. She's the wife of the Kohen. If the Kohen has a slave, in the days when they had slavery, the slave was half Jewish. When a Jew bought a slave, he had to convert him. It was a half conversion. Once he's freed, he becomes fully Jewish. The slave could eat truma. There are certain sacrifices that only a Kohen could eat, but he could feed it to his wife, to his children, and to his slaves. Why? There was animals. Now, an animal is certainly not on the same level as a Kohen. You can't have a Kohen animal. But because they're connected to the Kohen, they are elevated into his stature with regard to eating truma. The same thing is true when you make a bracha. You are elevated. You are now living in a different dimension. You are no longer who you are privately, individually. You are now someone who is elevated to a divine position. And therefore, you're eating your food. It's your food as much as it's God's food because you are now godly. As long as you made that bracha. When we make a bracha, we become God's subjects and we redefine who we are. We're no longer the same person. Just a little story that defines how people could relate to this. The story has nothing to do with bracha, but it has to do with the idea of redefining yourself. How human beings could redefine themselves in their relationships with others. And you could apply this to God as well. The story is told of a certain chassid who followed a certain Rabbi, a very holy man, very devoted to him. And he had a father, the chassid, who was not interested in going to this rabbi. He says, look, it's not my cup of tea. You can go to him, but I'm happy the way I am. And the son was trying to convince his father to become a follower of that Rebbe. And he nudged him, he harassed him every week. He said, come with me for Shabbat. You'll see this Rebbe, you'll see the way he prays and the way he talks and the way he teaches. You'll be so impressed, you'll become his follower. One day he says, look, you want me to go so badly, I'll go, but it's not going to change me. I'm happy the way I am. So he goes to this Rebbe for Shabbat, and the Rebbe led the services and was fire. It was so passionate, it was so profound, it was so holy. And the son asked the father afterwards, no, what do you say now? He says, well, it's very nice, I'm impressed, but it's not for me. And the whole Shabbat, he was exposed to this Rebbe, and after Shabbat was over, the father says, look, I know why you're a follower. He's very impressive and everything, but it's just not my cup of tea. It's not something that I feel connected to. So let's go home. So the son says, I'll tell you what, there's one other function after Shabbat is over, we eat another meal called Malava Malka. We escort the queen. The Shabbat is called the queen. So and the Hasidim get together in someone's house, and they have a meal. They sing, and they talk words of Torah, they tell stories. So I always go to that Saturday night, so please join me. He says, okay, I'll join you. And he goes into the house, and it's packed with Hasidim. There's a man sitting at the head of the table, and he's saying, oh, that must be the house, the owner of the house. Then he sees another person running the whole show. He said, oh, that must be And he kept on seeing that it seems that the owner of the house was everyone. And then he said, I'm becoming a chassid. What he saw was that nobody there felt that it was his house, and everyone felt it was his house. There was such a brotherhood of feeling amongst them that when they came to someone else's house, they felt it was their house. That's the ultimate level of hospitality, where the guest feels that it's his or her house, and you feel no less. You're not threatened by it. You accept it and enjoy it. So that's where you come to someone else's house and you become part of that household. That's exactly what happens whenever you make a bracha. You are invited into God's house, and you don't know whose house it is. It's God's. It's mine or God's. It's the same thing. The Sfas Emes is a Hasidic work by one of the Rebbes from the Ger dynasty. And he says that the blessing is a mystical idea to a blessing. Everything in this physical world has a spark of holiness in it that's deeply embedded in it. And that spark doesn't manifest itself until you say the blessing. So when you say the blessing, you're eliciting that spark. So there's a certain amount of holiness that you generate. At any rate, the point here is that when you say a blessing, you are now in a different mode. You're in God's home, sitting at his table, partaking of his food as if it's your own. And maybe that's a reason why in the first temple era, the blessing was not necessary, because you felt that way just because that was in the atmosphere. That was something that people felt consciously at all times. So that introduction will go to the blessing that we say on bread. Bread is considered to be the most important food in Judaism. Today they tell you bread is not good for you, but throughout history, and it's in the Torah, lechem levav enosh yisad, bread satisfies, satiates the heart of man. And there are many other verses and statements that put bread on a pedestal in relation to all other foods. So bread has its own blessing. And what is the blessing for bread? It starts with the traditional beginning, where we already explained what those words mean. Baruch atah Shem Elokeinu melech haolam. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe. And then we end, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. They translate it here, who brings forth bread from the earth.
Why is bread so special?
Why is it special? Because in those days, that was the most important food. Meat was a delicacy, but bread was an absolute necessity. Bread is satisfying. It doesn't leave you hungry. You eat vegetables, you still feel hunger. Doesn't satiate as much. This text is based on a psalm, Psalm 104, where it says, he causes vegetation to sprout for the cattle and plants for the service of man, to bring forth bread from the earth. Which raises a question on the text of the psalm and also the blessing. Does bread come from the earth? Bread doesn't come from the earth. Bread comes from the oven, which comes from the dough, which comes from flour, which comes from grain, which comes from the earth. But the bread itself doesn't come from the earth. When you make a blessing on a fruit, you say, Bore pri ha'etz. Blessed is the creator of the fruit of the tree. The fruit is a fruit of a tree, or a vegetable, pri ha'adama, the fruit of the earth. That makes sense, but bread does not come from the earth. So the simple explanation, if you have to give it the simplest explanation, is that ultimately bread comes from the earth. It doesn't come directly from the earth. It goes through a processing, but it does come from the earth. But that's forced explanation. Why did they have to focus and emphasize that bread comes from the earth? So there's a philosophical commentary on the Torah called the Akedah. Lived about 600 years ago. And he writes that this is an allusion to the future, when bread will, in fact, grow on trees. One of the biblical predictions about the Messianic age is that everything will be fully and ready for us to consume. When you read the Torah about Adam, remember Adam and Eve, and they ate of the forbidden fruit, and they were cursed. What was Adam's curse? The sweat of the brow, you will consume bread. That means you're not going to get bread plucking it off a tree. You're going to have to sweat for it. You're going to have to cultivate the earth. And the earth is going to have a lot of thorns and thistles. And you're going to have to get through all those challenges. And you're going to have to water it. And you're going to have to plow. And it's a long process until you can get the bread. That was a curse. But the ultimate goal will be, in the Messianic age, that curses will be eliminated. Women will no longer have travail in pregnancy and childbirth. That was one of the curses as well. We won't have to struggle for these things. So that's why we say the blessing referring to the future. In fact, there's a whole big discussion about what does the word Hamotzi mean. They translate here who brings forth bread from the earth. The Talmud says it could also be who brought forth, past tense. It could also mean present tense, and it could also be future tense, because in fact it means all three. When you're talking about the past, the simple meaning of past is that when you're eating the fruit or the bread, it's already happened. It was already produced. But the deeper meaning is that it hails back to the beginning of time before Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit. Then bread would grow off the tree. There was nothing to do to process bread.
There's nothing to do with manna?
Manna is a, you could say, is a sample of the future where the bread, but it is and it isn't, because Torah actually says that the manna they also had to crush, they had to grind, they had to bake it, they had to cook it. In fact, it's interesting, the word for baking is tofu, you will bake. And manna had the taste of every food. So some people say that's a hint to tofu. You can turn tofu into anything. I'm not sure that's what the Torah meant, but it's a cute association. Yeah, I'm missing something over here.
It ends abruptly.
It ends up, it's not the whole thing. Okay, I'm going to have to ad-lib now. So, Hamotzi refers to both, as I said before, the past, the present, and the future. The present, what is the present? The Baal Shem Tov taught us that creation is a continuous process. If someone asks you, when was creation? And we give a date, so many years back. No, that's not totally accurate. Creation occurs every instant. When the psalmist says, your words are forever standing in the heavens. So the Baal Shem Tov says that means that the words that the Torah uses to create the heavens, Yehi Rakia, may there be a heaven, or any other Yehi, there should be light, there should be vegetation, those words represent the divine power of creation. Those words are forever recreating everything. What does that mean? If I take some wood and I turn it into a table, what happens to the table once I leave it? It's still there. Unless I did a shoddy job, then it'll fall apart. But if I did a good job, I'm a good carpenter, the table will still be around. And that's true for anything that a person builds. If a person builds something, they're creating something out of nothing, you'd think. There was no table before, now there's a table. But no, they're not really creating it out of nothing. They're creating it out of wood. And the wood always had that potential to be formed into any type of piece of furniture. The wood cannot be turned into a song. It can't be turned into a physical theory. It has to be turned into a physical object. So it always had the potential. It was always here. So when we change things, we're not really creating. The word creation can only be used in one context, accurately. You could use it whatever you want. It's a free country. But when you say someone created an object, it's not true. It's not created. It's formed. You took some substance and you formed it into something else. The only true creator in creation is the creation of the universe by God, who created everything out of absolute nothingness. There was no original power and a big bang that caused it to expand. Because where did that original thing come from? That original thing came from God creating it out of absolute nothingness. Absolute nothingness. No potential for it. That's what makes creation unique. And that's why the word that we use for creation can only be used for God creating the universe. You could use it if you like. Someone could create a symphony. You could create poetry. But you're not creating it out of nothing. It seems that way sometimes, and all of a sudden you become, a light bulb turns on, and you think of a new idea that you never thought of before. But it's based on something else. It's just very remote from what you had consciously. It came from an unconscious part of you, but there was always a potential. You cannot create something out of nothing. Because if you have some potential in any form, in any way, that is something which turns into something else. But God created the universe out of absolute nothingness. So when you eat a piece of bread, where did the bread come from? Or when did it come around? It started off at the farm where the wheat was grown, and then the wheat was ground, and then it was turned into flour, into dough, and then it was baked. No, every second there's a continuous process that you have to recognize with regard to everything, not just bread, but even when we eat bread, it uses a word that could also mean present tense. There's right now, you're going through that process. Yes?
Just to make a point that physicists actually endorse almost everything you just said.
Some physicists do.
That everything that's in that bread was present, they don't say from God, but was present at the Big Bang. Everything that was in that bread, every atom molecule was present at the Big Bang, which we believe God created. Mm-hmm. But everything, they would say everything was there when He made it.
Right, so they're not really, nothing really changed. What changes the shape of things, the form they take, but matter itself was created out of nothing and had no basis. And that's why it uses the present tense, as well as the past tense, as well as the future tense. The past tense points to the time when Adam and Eve, before the sin, where bread would not have to be processed, and it deals with the future as well, where that will return to the way it was. The word lechem, we translate as bread. But what's the etymology of the word lechem? It's the same as the word for war, milchama. has the same root letters. So gesund. A bread involves a war. What kind of war is there? It's a struggle to get from the point of planting wheat or whatever else the bread is from until it becomes edible and could be put on your table and you could eat it and it nourishes you. There's a war that goes on from the time it starts until the time it's perfected. But it's more than just a physical war, it's also a spiritual war. Bread is the symbol of materialism, of physicality. There's a constant struggle between us and the physical world, how we relate to it. You could relate to the physical world and use it to indulge and to become a prisoner of the material way of living, as most people in society do. The whole goal of a society is, what do you grow up to be? You grow up to be whatever you want to be so you can make a good living, so you can live a good life, so that you can finally retire and play golf and tennis, as long as you can still do it. And then it looks like that there is no real purpose in life. And that's the natural instinct of a physical human being, to want to satisfy one's own human needs and desires. But the ultimate goal is to struggle with that and to overcome it. And the best model for that is bread. Bread is a struggle to get to the bread because it doesn't just come automatically. And that's what we focus on when we say the words, Hamotzi lechem, that get this bread, there's a lechem, there's a battle, there's a struggle. Another thing that this blessing highlights, when we talk about bread coming from the earth. Well, as I said before, bread doesn't directly come from the earth. There's a whole process. Well, that's exactly the point over here. Some people, there are two extremes in every area of life, and the Torah usually has the balance. One extreme in life is that human beings have the power and the right to do whatever they want because they control everything. And more powerful human beings control all other human beings. That's what motivates people like Putin, and people like Hitler and Stalin. These are the people who feel that they have the right to dominate others because they're on top of the pyramid. But that's true about every one of us. We feel we have a right to dominate the earth, to do whatever we want with the earth, because we're human after all. We're more powerful. The strong like to dominate the weak. That's one extreme philosophy that many of us have it in a very subtle way. Then there's the other extreme. The other extreme is that the first extreme glorifies humanity and deifies human logic, human ingenuity, human capabilities. The other extreme is we worship the earth. That we're just, usurpers. We're just trespassers on the earth. The earth belongs to the trees and the bears and all the other creatures, and we have to bow to the earth. That's a pagan notion, but it's also a very common philosophy that the earth is really what controls us, and we have no right to exercise any control over the earth, because the earth represents, and even within spiritual philosophies, they sometimes would always prefer something that's natural over something that's man-made. And there's some truth to that and some legitimacy to that if you have a choice of taking a medication or taking a natural remedy, we prefer the natural remedy because hasn't been tainted and it's probably going to be doing a better job. But you take that philosophy to the extreme, it becomes a very negative philosophy, that humanity is outside of the pale of God's world. We're the usurpers, we're the criminals. And we have to recognize that human ingenuity is also divine. It also came from God. When you create a synthetic medicine, again, if there's a natural remedy, it makes sense, it's logic that you should take it preferred over a synthetic one if the natural one is just as good. But the synthetic one is also part of God's world. Because who created the synthetic in a laboratory? Human beings. And who gave human beings the ingenuity? God did. It's also God-made. So Judaism doesn't go to one extreme or the other. Yes, we believe that everything in this world comes from God, including our ingenuity. So if we come up with a brilliant idea, we don't knock it because it's human, because it empowers us, because it doesn't empower us, it empowers God. So that's why the blessing, we focus on how the bread comes from the earth, which means that there's a whole process. We're thanking God for the process as well, not just for the food, but for the ingenuity that we had. How did anyone figure this out? Someone decided one day, you know what? I'm going to plant wheat. Well, where did they get the wheat from to plant? The first cavemen, well, they didn't eat wheat. They hunted. But whoever thought of bread, how could have anyone thought of bread? You plant wheat, and then when the wheat grows, you take the kernels and you thresh it and you winnow it and this is more brilliant than anything Einstein could have thought of to create bread. It's God's endowing human beings with ingenuity. Whoever invented the wheel was more brilliant than any of the major scientists today because they came from nothing, but it was God's ingenuity. And that's what's highlighted in the blessing of Hamotzi. But then, let's take the last word, min haaretz, from the earth. Earth has two words that are used. In fact, in blessings, when we make a blessing on a vegetable, we say, Bore pri ha'adama. Blessed is the creator of the fruit of the Adama. Adama is earth. Adam was called Adam because he came from Adama, from the earth. Yet over here we say min haaretz, from the land. The Maharal, one of the great Jewish philosophers, explains the difference between Aretz and Adama. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but there's a difference. We call the earth the whole globe. Earth represents something that endures, that lasts. Adama is the particular earth that you're planting a seed into. When you're talking about bread, bread is much more than just food. Bread is connected to something that is universal. Also, the word aretz, which means earth, and actually the word earth in English probably comes from the word aretz. Earth, aretz. People don't realize this, that there certainly are hundreds of English words that no one really attributes to Hebrew that come directly from Hebrew, that somehow entered into English and likewise other languages. But be that as it may, Aretz, the Talmud asks, why is Israel referred to as Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel? And the Talmud answers, Eretz has two roots, two meanings. One is ratzon, will, and the other one is rutz, running. Israel is a land that naturally has this disposition to run to do God's will. The earth itself in Israel is so holy that it generates a spiritual energy that gives us the desire, the ambition to do God's will. So when we talk about lechem, which is the idea of fighting a war, that's fighting a war on one hand, but we have the energy that comes from the earth to be able to win that war and to prevail over the struggles that we have, the physical struggles and the spiritual struggles, more importantly. So anytime we make the blessing, any blessing, the first focus is that the food we have came from God. And any other way of looking at it is like the child, someone takes a glove, puts it on his hands, and through a opening in the doorway, the door's opened a little, drops a toy or a candy for a little child. And this is repeated over and over again. What does the child believe? That the candy came from a glove. That gloves provide candy. But then you tell the child, no, there's a hand in a glove. He gets older and he sees how people put hands in a glove. He says, oh, the candy came from a hand. But then when a child gets older, the child realizes the hand is attached to a body, and the body is a human being that gave him the candy. The glove has nothing to do with giving the candy. It's just a delivery mechanism. The hand, as important as the hand is, you don't thank the hand. You don't acknowledge the hand. You acknowledge the giver. And that's what the blessing, first and foremost, is there to establish. And also to change our whole mindset that we're no longer sitting at our table, we're sitting at God's table. And it elevates the whole process, the whole experience of eating. Provided when we say the blessing, we're thinking what the blessing is about. That's a challenge also. People who say the blessing every day, every time they eat, it could become something you do by rote, and you're not even thinking what you just said. So that's the challenge, to constantly pause for a second and to think before you say the blessing. I think my father-in-law, before he said a blessing, would put his hand on his head like this to reflect on the blessing. And he would say it very slowly, which is the ideal way of doing it. Any questions? Yes?
Towards the end of your talk, I sneezed, and you said to me, Gesundheit.
Something like
And
that.
yeah, it was very quick, a half a second. So you gave me a blessing then. But the question that I have is, and I said thank you. I was saying thank you to you, but should I really have been saying thank you to him and gratitude to you?
The same thing. Gratitude and thank you are synonymous. You always thank God for everything, but you also have to thank people who are nice, who do the right thing.
Right, so I thanked you. You made the blessing, you requested blessing from God for me, for my sneeze. And in that process, you get sort of credit for being the one who made a blessing, and I'm the recipient of the blessing you made. But then, am I obligated to make a blessing personally, or did you do it for me?
The obligation of a blessing, the formal obligation with a text, is only for food and for fragrances, not for any other pleasure. So if let's say you get a gift from someone, it's a benefit to you, you're deriving pleasure, you don't have to say a formal text in the blessing. Why that's so? Why they only composed blessings for food? One simple reason might be is if you'd have to say a blessing for every benefit, that's all you'd be doing all day long. Because every moment you're breathing, you have to be grateful for every breath you take and for everything in life. So the rabbis limited it only to food, which is the most essential part of your existence. And from there you extrapolate that it applies to everything. Yes?
People always say Baruch Hashem.
Yes, when someone asks you how you're doing, you say Baruch Hashem, thank God, blessed is Hashem. Yes.
So
But
maybe it's,
yeah.
maybe it's not a blessing, but like when you wear clothing for the first time or something like that, are those not considered blessings?
Okay, that's another a good point. There is a law that when you experience an incredible event, a positive event, that you say a special blessing called Shehechayanu, thanking God for having lived to this time. But that's very subjective. That's a different kind of blessing. It's very subjective. So nowadays, most people don't say that blessing when they buy a new article of clothing, because we are very careful that we don't say unnecessary blessings. I didn't mention this, but I should mention it, that every blessing that we say has to be mandated, has to be required. If, let's say, someone wants to say Hamotzi every bite he takes on the bread. You're eating a loaf of a big piece of bread, you take one bite, you swallow it, oh, I'll say Hamotzi again for the next bite. No, that's wrong, because then you're saying God's name in vain. Just as we're supposed to say his name when it's important, we're supposed to not say it when it's not required. So the blessing of Shechayanu, since it's subjective, it's based on your pleasure, most people do not say that blessing when buying a new article. When you eat a new fruit that you haven't had the whole season, it wasn't available the whole season, then we say the blessing of Shechayanu before eating the food, because it's a special delight that God has provided. If you let's say win the lottery, you would probably say Shechayanu.
So with reflection to that, then, as per personal gratitude, can you just take a moment to reflect? And be
Yes,
grateful, but not
the blessing is the
necessarily
formal, institutionalized way of reminding us of our responsibilities. But that doesn't mean that after you finish the blessing, you forget about it. No, it's important to always be aware of it, and the blessing helps us remind us of it. Okay, any other questions? Any questions on the Zoom?